Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming on this rather dreary morning, but inside we will try very hard to make it not so dreary. Welcome to the Worcester Regional Research Bureau's forum, Municipal Budgets in Limbo. How low can they go? My name is Roberta Schaefer, and I'm the President and CEO of the Research Bureau. Today's program is part of the Bureau's Francis A. Harrington Forums. We would like to express our gratitude to the City of Worcester for hosting today's event in this wonderful room, and to greet us today is Mayor Constantina Lukes.
Good morning, everyone. This room has been newly refurbished, and on February 2nd, we reopened it as a public meeting room. For you history buffs, this used to be the location of the Common Council, and in 1947, when we had a charter change, the room was changed, and not for the better, into small little offices and storage space. And Councilor Clancy led the way to restoring it to its original use. So we're proud to have this room now open to the public, and it's been heavily used. It's named after Levi Lincoln, a junior who lived between 1782 and 1868. And he was the first mayor in 1848. Prior to being the mayor, he was the governor of Massachusetts for 9 consecutive terms. I think that was a form of some kind of physical abuse, but nevertheless, he put in his public service. He was also a state senator, a state representative, Speaker of the House of Representatives, President of the State Senate, Lieutenant Governor, a U.S. Congressman, Associate Justice of the State Supreme Court, and Governor. So I think he epitomized public service to the nth degree, and so we have named this room after him. We also have a rostrum here, because in 1947, after we changed the use of this room, that rostrum was declared surplus, and it disappeared into one of our vacant schools that was also declared surplus. And at an auction, as I was sitting there and noticed that there was something familiar about the podium at which the auctioneer was conducting the auction, it occurred to me there was a reason why it was familiar. It's the exact mate of the rostrum that we use in the city council chambers. And so I was able to buy it back from the bidder at substantially higher price than he paid for it just an hour before. And on the sides, we have, in a very inconspicuous place, a list of the 31 donors who also helped to contribute to the cost of bringing it here. It's newly refurbished, it looks lovely, and we are going to be using it as part of the room. So we're proud of the work done on this room. We're proud to have you all here and welcome you here for this meeting and many more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Lukes. I suspect that this, what you just heard today, will be on the next MCAS. Today's program, as I mentioned, is part of the Francis Harrington Forums on Municipal Government, and it is sponsored by Bank of America. The Research Bureau also wishes to express its appreciation to the Telegram and Gazette for advertising today's event, and the City of Worcester Government Channel under the direction of Judy Warren for videotaping it. This event will be rebroadcast on Worcester's Government Channel 12, as well as many other local government channels in area towns. So be sure to check your local listing. Also be sure to visit the Research Bureau's website, www.wrrb.org, where you can read and download Research Bureau reports, as well as announcements for upcoming events and highlights from past events. You can be notified when there are new postings by adding your name to our list. So just join our conversation and sign up, send us your email, and you will be notified of all events. We also have a blog, and we would love to hear your views on various issues. I'm also pleased to announce that the Research Bureau will hold its 24th annual meeting on Wednesday, June 3rd, at noon at Mechanics Hall. Our featured speaker this year is Amity Shlaes, the New York Times bestselling author. She wrote this book, The Forgotten Man, in 2007, before the current crisis, and it has a great many insights into what worked and what did not work in pulling this nation out of the Great Depression. So please mark your calendar and join us on June 3rd. For this very timely event. The Research Bureau, now let me turn to today's program. The Research Bureau organizes an annual program to discuss the state of state and municipal finances. Our current economic crisis makes it especially important for both citizens and public officials to understand the depth of the problems we face and the state and the government and local government's responses thus far. We brought together a distinguished panel and very knowledgeable people to address these issues. So let's get started, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Ed Shea, who's the moderator of today's program. Ed joined the Bank of America in 1994, and in 2006 he was named Central Mass Market President for Bank of America. He received a BA in economics from the University of Massachusetts and an MBA from Western New England College. He's volunteered with numerous nonprofit groups, including Junior Achievement, the Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Greater Boston Food Bank, the Center for Women in Enterprise, Springboard Venture Forum, and several youth programs in the town of Shrewsbury, where he resides. He's currently a board member of Mechanics Hall, and he joined the Research Bureau board in 2006. Bank of America has been a longtime supporter of the Bureau, and most recently at our highest level of sponsorship, the Endowed Chair. Please join me in welcoming Ed Shea.
Thank you, Roberta. Good morning. As moderator, my role will be to keep things on schedule and to introduce the speakers. What I'd like to do is introduce the speakers in the order in which they'll present, and we'll just roll right into the presentations upon completion. Joining us this morning is Leanne Pasquini, is the Assistant Budget Director at the Executive Office for Administration and Finance. In her role there, she oversees the development of Governor's annual budget recommendation for all areas of government, including education, public safety, transportation, healthcare, and the judiciary. She has been with A&F since the beginning of the Patrick Murray administration. Prior to her work at A&F, Leanne was a consultant for Public Consulting Group, Inc., specializing in maximizing federal reimbursements to states for their foster care programs. She holds an MBA from Clark University here in Worcester. Welcome, Leanne. Brian Goslin is the Education and Local Aid Analyst at the Executive Office for Administration and Finance. He has been with A&F for 2 years, specializing in budgets related to education, the lottery, and other local aid programs. Prior to joining A&F, Brian was a business analyst at Public Consultant Group, Inc., where he focused on state and local revenue projects to maximize federal revenues in the area of Medicaid and child welfare. Next is Mr. Michael V. O'Brien, Worcester City Manager. In his 5 years as City Manager, Michael O'Brien has worked to bolster economic development and the quality of life in the state's second largest city. He has enacted government reform and reorganization, employed new technology to improve the delivery of city services, negotiated changes in employee contributions for health benefits, initiated business-modeled financial forecasting to improve the city's bond rating, and created for the first time an interdepartmental task force to concentrate the entire range of services in a single neighborhood. The overreaching theme of his administration has been to preserve and enhance the quality of life in Worcester through development of partnerships. Mr. O'Brien has been with the City of Worcester since 1994. He was named Commissioner of Parks, Recreation, and Cemetery Department in 1997, where he stimulated community participation in the implementation of master plans for parks at a time when direct city resources for such efforts were dwindling due to budgetary pressure. He was named acting city manager in March 2004 and received permanent appointment that June. He recently negotiated a 5-year contract extension with the City Council. Mr. O'Brien received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, in 1988, a few years after me. Dan Morgado has been town manager for the town of Shrewsbury since September 1997. Prior to that, he served as the town of Grafton's first town administrator for a period of 10 years and town administrator for the towns of Easton and Blackstone. His initial experience in the field of public administration was as a college student, where he was elected to the planning board of the town of Swansea at the age of 21. He is also an instructor in the Clark University MPA program, teaching several different courses, but specializing in the area of policy analysis and local government management. He has also been active in the Massachusetts Municipal Association, serving as past management chairman of the Joint Labor Management Committee for Municipal Police and Fire. He is a graduate of Bridgewater State College and holds an MPA from Clark University. So with that, Leanne.
Brian and I are filling in for Secretary Kerwin today, and as you know, if you've ever dealt with Secretary Kerwin or heard her speak, they're pretty big shoes to fill, so we'll certainly do our best. We're going to give an overview of the Governor's House 1 budget recommendations, and Brian's going to talk a little bit about local aid, but we promise to keep within the time constraints, because we know there's a lot to say today and many questions that you may have. So again, I'm going to talk about consensus revenue and the budget gap that we're dealing with for FY09 and specifically FY10. Some solutions that we came up with for FY10, and then just running through the blueprint of our budget, the Governor's House 1 recommendations, including the reductions taken and revenues and use of federal stimulus and stabilization funds. And then again, Brian's going to speak specifically to the treatment of local aid in the Governor's budget recommendations. So, consensus revenue update for FY09. Our original consensus revenue estimate was $21.4 billion. This is simply related to tax revenue. In October, we had to go through a revision of our consensus revenue down to $20.3 billion, which triggered a 9C exercise. So the governor had to reduce allotments to agencies to live within our revenue streams that were coming in. In January, again, we had to do another revision based upon testimony from the Governor's Council on Economic Advisors to bring revenue down to $19.45 billion, an additional downward revision. Our current balance sheet that we have is about $180 million out of balance for FY09, meaning we've recognized some exposures that are on our balance sheet that we'll eventually have to file for supplemental funding for. And then we have a cushion in there for approximately $100 million for things that we know are going to come up toward the end of the year. One thing in particular that I'm sure cities and towns are dealing with is snow and ice. I think our snow and ice budget is larger than it's ever been in history, and I suspect it's not over yet. So the total shortfall for FY09 that we were solving for, or we're continuing to solve for, is $1.132 billion. Obviously, any revenue that happens in 09 or changes in revenue that happen into 09 roll directly into FY10. So when we were developing our consensus revenue number with the House and Senate, our consensus revenue number came out to be $19.53 billion. Well, that's all well and good, but it was about $1 billion below what we were originally estimating when we started building the governor's budget recommendations. So that brought us to a shortfall in the governor's FY10 House 1 recommendations of $3.5 billion, based upon a $1.9 billion revenue problem, a $1.2 billion maintenance problem, and what that means is when we ask agencies to build their budget for us, we ask them, okay, next year, to provide the same level of program and services, how much would it cost for you to do that? And those maintenance increases for fuel and drugs and things like that increased by $1.2 billion. And in addition to that, the FY09 budget originally was predicated upon a $400 million use of stabilization funds. So that was an additional amount we had to solve for, which brought us to the $3.5 billion that we were solving for the governor's budget. To solve for that $3.5 billion, we used a number of different sources, including spending reductions, revenues, and use of one-time revenues, including stabilization funds and stimulus, which at the time were estimates because we didn't have the federal bill signed into law. So some spending reductions we took, and these are just some examples, and I think, below in the executive and non-executive branch cut, there's a lump sum there, and those constitute a number of different programs and services that were reduced, so I'm not doing it justice on this slide. But overall, we took spending cuts and reductions from every agency. We took $60 million in savings by changing the state employee health care contribution, so tiering your contribution to your health care based upon your salary versus on your date of hire. We took cost controls and savings in our Medicaid program, which is an $8 billion program, matched 50% by the federal government. So we took a net reduction in our Medicaid program of $178 million. Local aid reductions, which I'm sure folks in this room are interested in, Brian will talk a little bit more about, of $220 million. We maintained our current Chapter 70 number for education funding. When we were building our budget, the maintenance budget for Chapter 70 actually would have Chapter 70 increasing by $300 to $400 million. So by level funding, we were able to save $300 million as part of our recommendation. And then executive and non-executive branch cuts, as I mentioned, every sector of government was hit. Net revenues, including some tax increases and the elimination of certain sales tax exemptions, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then other departmental revenue in the form of fees and fines and other smaller items across many agencies. And again, I'll talk about those in a few minutes. We did use additional stabilization funds, and then we also use an estimate of federal recovery money, so money from the stimulus bill, which again, at the time was an estimate, and we have slightly more information on, and our estimates were conservative enough, which we're glad about. The bottom line of the governor's budget recommendations is $27.9 billion. That's about a 0.7% decrease from the FY09 GAA, or the FY09 budget. However, you need to make an apples-to-apples comparison, so you need to do some adjustments. We brought over some county sheriffs onto the budget this year, which increased our spending and our revenue. When you adjust that out to make that apples-to-apples comparison, the bottom line is about 27.902, or a 0.5% increase. Now, you just heard me say we took all of these reductions, so how is the budget still increasing? There are things that we are constitutionally required to pay for that have increases. And then also our Medicaid program, even though restrained, still grows at a specific rate every year. But debt service, our employee health insurance program, Medicaid, those are types of things that grow regardless. So even though we're taking all these reductions, the budget continues to grow. The bottom line of the budget, though, when people talk about the budget, they talk about a $28 billion budget. But one thing it needs to consider are certain revenue transfers that we make. And we make revenue transfers into specific funds, mainly for our healthcare programs, the Commonwealth Care Program, retiree health insurance, and also for life sciences. So when you consider those revenue transfers that we do, the bottom line of the budget is actually about $32 billion. So that's what we should think about when we're thinking about the state budget. The governor and A&F continues to prioritize reforms, and our spending cuts do account for about 50% of the reductions we needed to take to meet our $3.5 billion. I mentioned that there were certain departmental revenue solves, and I'm just going to speed through these quickly. $75 million at the RMV for increased fees, so this will be affecting many citizens in government, many citizens across the Commonwealth. They're also reforming the fee structure to bring the fees from 250 down to about 50. And there's actually increases and decreases here. We have some really good data, and we have a budget brief that explains what some of these increases and decreases are and how people will be impacted. $75 million increase in the nursing home user fee. This is maximizing the amount of dollars that we can get from the federal government for what we pay for nursing home utilization. $26 million for DOR auditors, Department of Revenue auditors. So if we do some more auditing of taxes, we can get additional tax revenue in. $20 million by expanding the bottle bill to different types of beverages, and that'll be dedicated to very specific items, and $20 million from smaller fee proposals across different agencies. We're also using $73 million from TANF contingency funds, temporary assistance to needy families. The federal government will actually match us on certain programs and services that we provide in the Commonwealth, and that'll be an additional $73 million. Tax revenue I mentioned, we eliminated certain sales tax exemptions, so on soda, candy, and alcohol, and that's going to be effective, or we're hoping it would be effective this year if the legislature were to pass it, and be dedicated to the Health and Wellness Fund to pay for certain programs at our Department of Public Health so we can continue to provide those programs. And then the statewide meals and hotel motel room occupancy taxes, which I'll let Brian talk a little bit more about because those tax revenues were specifically dedicated to local aid. This is something that's been of much interest to people, and I think, as I mentioned, a lot of our meetings have turned into discussions about federal stimulus. We did use federal stimulus and stabilization, which are one-time revenue sources, when developing our budget recommendations. We tried to be conservative and we tried to be careful. At the time we were releasing our budget, we had an estimate that we would receive FMAP, or Federal Medical Assistance Program money, for our healthcare programs. we'd receive about 1.6 billion of that. So for FY10, we programmed in about a 711 million. We also programmed some of those dollars into FY09, and we're working very carefully with the federal government to ensure we can draw down those funds. And then in addition, we use stabilization funds. Stabilization funds are our most flexible dollars, so we really want to hold on to those as much as possible so that we can be sure that if we need them later on, we can have them there to use. So we were more aggressive in use of federal stimulus and held back on our stabilization so that we would have that cushion there. I'm going to turn it over to Brian. He's going to talk specifically about local aid. What I just said is a ton of information about a pretty big budget. We have a lot of information online, and we'd be willing to answer any questions that you have. So here's Brian.
Thanks, Lan, and good morning, everyone. Before we talk about local aid, I just think it's important to emphasize that Governor Patrick, Lieutenant Governor Murray, and Secretary Kerwin all really recognize, understand, and appreciate the challenge that the state's budget presents to municipalities for fiscal year 9 and fiscal year 10. And the decisions that we made in this budget obviously are not easy, and the ones that are being made at the municipal level we recognize are also really challenging. So in formulating the fiscal year 10 budget, one of the priorities of the administration was really to minimize the cuts to local aid, despite the unprecedented fiscal challenges that we were all faced here. To do this, we had to do a few things. In Section 3 in the budget, as you well know, is the main part of the budget that addresses local aid. It's the biggest pot of money. It's about $5 billion. And we had to restructure it in order to apply an equal reduction methodology that we needed to take to achieve budgetary balance to meet our constitutional obligation to file a balanced budget. So first, we had to create a new category. And this year, you recognize that we have a new category called unrestricted general government aid. And this is a combination of additional assistance and lottery aid, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And we did that for a couple reasons. Additional assistance is based on a formula, $379 million, that hasn't been run since 1992. 159 municipalities out of 351 only receive additional assistance. And as you well know, the lottery in fiscal year 07, excuse me, fiscal year 07, fiscal year 8, and fiscal year 9, the revenues have fallen short, and the state has made up the difference already for fiscal year 7 and 8, and then we're also wrestling with what to do for fiscal year 09. In addition, there are two new columns that we implemented in Section 3 in the budget for new revenues, revenue enhancements to help cities and towns and mitigate the $375 million reduction we needed to take to achieve balance. What's important to note about these two revenues, it's a 1% statewide increase on meals tax and hotel-motel room occupancy tax. And then in addition, we filed emergency legislation to allow for an additional 1% local option. The biggest part of Chapter 70 that most school districts looked at right away is Chapter 70 in Section 3. And we maintained $3.9 billion in that. We did not utilize the formula and run it, because as Leanne said, that would cost us $300 to $400 million above and beyond the $3.9 billion that we're already providing. And I think this really represents the administration's commitment to stabilizing some of the budgets for school committees. And overall, if you look at the local aid picture for Section 3, with the mitigation that we provided with the revenue enhancements, it's about a 4.17% reduction below fiscal year 9 GAA, or fiscal year 09 budget. With the recognition that cities and towns rely heavily on state aid to support local government for all types of services, not just schools, that Chapter 70 supports, the administration, as I said earlier, made it a priority to mitigate these. Without the revenue enhancements that we provided for in House 1, local aid's budget is reduced by $375 million, which is a 7.1% reduction below fiscal year 09. By implementing, or prompt implementation of these state taxes, $156 million of that $375 million will be mitigated. And also, our methodology in Section 3 ensures that no city and town will lose more than 10% of its local aid from fiscal year 09 GAA levels. So we also had to apply a portion of mitigation aid from the state's general fund to assist some cities and towns where that were above the 10% mark, because they rely a little bit more on the additional assistance and lottery prior years than they do Chapter 70. With that said, we figured we'd update you on our current status. We're currently working with our agencies to first understand the further reductions we had to take in January for the 9C process that we did then, and also that rolls into fiscal year 10, so we're trying to understand the full impact that our reductions will have in the next fiscal year. So we're working closely with our agencies right now, and we're continuing to monitor the revenue situation, which is not looking very good, as I'm sure you're all aware. The revenue continues to deteriorate, and we're going to have to figure out how to make it out fiscal year 09 with a balanced budget, and also do we need to look at fiscal year 10 and revise some of our budget recommendations if the revenues continue to deteriorate. So with that said, we'd be happy to take any questions at the end.
Good morning. I don't see a lot of smiles in the audience. It's a good day to be alive, I would say, so let's start there. I do want to welcome you all to Worcester City Hall and to Levi Lincoln Chamber, and I did want to take a moment to thank Councilor Clancy. Going back to my days of commissioner, he advocated to have this room turned back into its rightful use, which is a public meeting space. And back then, it was a turf and territory issue about this being the exclusive domain of the city manager, and though there were probably 4 or 5 staff people in this room, you could see it was underutilized at the time for its rightful use. And so here we are today, because it's not about turf and territory, but it's about serving the public and doing the public's business and allowing these types of forums and other activities of city government to be inclusive of our community and have spaces like this to do our business. So I did want to take the time to thank Councilor Clancy. It was one of the items he mentioned to me as we were negotiating my first contract. So you could tell it was a priority, and rightfully so. And I wanted to take the time to thank Chairman Buckley, as well as the Research Bureau and Roberta for holding this forum. What's so important about what we face as a nation, or even as a city, is engaging the community. And so people understand the issues, they have the facts, and they can be part of an informed decision-making process. And that's how government works best, and these types of forums are critical to this process. I think we all recognize we're at a crossroads, and I would say that's nationally, regionally, as a Commonwealth, and certainly as a city. And the decisions we make in the near future and the actions we take collectively are going to be what decides how we get through these challenging times and set the nation on a firm footing, and beyond that, be able to stabilize our community and ensure that we're prepared for the next century in ways that speak to success. When all this economic turmoil happened, even the most rock-solid kind of Rock of Gibraltar types like Jim Del Signori, who's our city auditor, began to feel the effects. And on the darkest of days, Jim was susceptible just like all of us, and he stepped out on the window ledge of City Hall and unfortunately jumped. But the good news is he has a basement office, so Jim's still with us today. But you can look at this situation in 2 ways: is the glass half empty, or is the glass half full? And I'd say, from my perspective as city manager and citizen for our community, I'd say the glass is half full. And so what my job here is today is to give you a straight sense of where we stand, as well as a sense of optimism as to where we head, because, as I said too, I believe we're uniquely positioned to be able to take on this challenge. We've prepared well for what lies ahead. For those that follow city government over the last 5 years, we've looked to the reductions. We've put forward net new revenues, thoughtful and balanced for what our citizens can afford, and reforms, and that's a consistent drumbeat. Difficult reforms that meant that there had to be political courage to take those on, but we took those on, and we've benefited from them. We've adapted and retooled the city organization, top to bottom. We've made significant progress, and a lot of this isn't covered in headlines of the newspaper, to deal with all of these challenges, both creatively and collectively, all for the good of our city. We're working from a solid foundation, not just city government, but our entire community. Tremendous assets, both existing and growing industry, college and our universities, one of our greatest assets, our not-for-profits, our infrastructure, which is second to none, with the exception of streets and sidewalks, which we're working on, whether it be our attractions or amenities, and leadership, which we're lucky enough to have tremendous leadership top to bottom and throughout our community. But the reality is we're not alone in this global economic crisis. I think we all recognize that, and these challenges are prevalent. And one of the things we have to make very clear is there's no white knights and no silver bullets here. The problems are at the federal level, they're at the Commonwealth level, they're in the private sector, and beyond. And all the reasonable assumptions, even the most wise economists have made 6 months ago, don't hold true now. So you're really operating on a day-to-day basis with the best reconnaissance you can have to make the wisest decision for the long term, which often has challenges unto itself. But the goals for city government remain the same, and this goes to how you build a community and sustain a community. It's about preserving core services that the taxpayers expect, that you bring forward fiscally responsible solutions for both our current problems as well as what the future holds, and you pursue opportunities, as difficult as they might be, for the betterment of the entire community, which often means that special interest has to be at least balanced against the needs of the broader city. And then ultimately look for a balanced budget, which is difficult in these times, both fiscal year 2009, fiscal year 2010. We're guiding all this from a city perspective from a 5-year financial plan, not the here and now decisions where it's politically expedient or that ultimately results in some small gains with not considering what does that cost mean 3 years out or 5 years out. And that's a change in philosophy of how government acts when typically it would be done in somewhat of a 2-year cycle. Which is critical when you're guiding a business of this size. You have to be thinking long-term if we're going to position our city for the next century. We have opportunity, I believe, but the focus must remain, and we must know real solutions will only come from ourselves. It's rugged individualism, it's self-determination that's going to make a difference here in Worcester. As I said, when federal stimulus is talked about, or we look at what might be some of the additional monies that could come forward, from either state government or federal government, it pales in comparison to our problems, and much of it will be one-time monies for what will be long-term and recurring costs. When you talk about city revenues, there's little diversification. We have state aid, we have property taxes, we have other fees and charges, and motor vehicle excise. And when you look at all those categories, anybody in business would say that you're going to be volatile at best because you're depending on 4 categories, all of which are either fixed by state statute or dependent on the local economy to be able to sustain growth. And all those categories are susceptible at this point. But one particular category which presents our challenges is that state aid to the city side of the equation is 25% of our budget. Over the last 8 years, that's been level funded. And that presents challenges unto itself. Next year, we expect on the city side local aid reductions, and this is a synthesis of what was just presented by the Commonwealth, where they talk about it being no less than 10%. On the city side of the equation, the reductions in state aid are going to be approximately 37%. But when you combine city and schools, because the governor has chosen to, or at least in his recommendation, chosen to level fund Chapter 70 for education, when you put those two numbers together, it may be less than 10% for the entire city. But the city side of the equation, for all the city side services, police, fire, code, health, DPW, those services will suffer from a 37% decrease. That's in the face of the fact that our fixed costs continue to grow and grow, factor 37% revenue reduction from state aid, and our fixed costs continue to grow at 6 to 8%. So the reality is schools will see level funding, at least in the governor's budget. There's talk that there'll be additional monies coming from the federal stimulus bill in the short term. Right now, we got early indications it may be as much as $17 million over 2 years for the Worcester Public Schools. And I'll get into some detail as to what we expect on the city side, at least so far. We've been having some challenges trying to determine exactly what's coming from the federal stimulus, how it'll be channeled, and what categories it'll be in. Our typical revenue growth, as I mentioned, on a year-to-year basis on a 5-year plan is about 4%. Next year, our overall revenues on the city side are expected to decrease by the better part of 6% on all categories. That leaves us with about a $30 million challenge unto itself. But then you got to look at our realities, collective bargaining agreements and the fixed costs that are within those, health care, which continues to grow for our employees at the better part of 10% increases that we expect next year, snow, talked about by the Commonwealth. Even with the best of efforts to increase that account, Mother Nature continues to be a great challenge, and this year alone we're looking at a $3 million deficit just for snow removal. So let's look at the city budget in kind of a big picture for you. It's approximately a $500 million operation in Worcester Public Schools and city side, of which approximately $270 million is mandated for public education. The balance is about $230 million of the city budget, and over $100 million of that $230 million is fixed costs. And that's a combination of retirement, debt service, snow removal, and then health insurance. And as I talked about, health insurance continues to escalate. I think everybody in the public and private sector is suffering from this. And we're looking at healthcare on a $500 million budget next year being approximately $80 million of our total costs. So you can see what we're talking about and why I've been so focused on reining in our cost of employee health care. That leaves about $129 million for operational budgets. That's the services our community depends on. It's the exemplary work of our Worcester Police Department that continues to keep our community one of the safest in the Commonwealth, if not the region, and the work of Department of Public Works, Fire, and Health, Code, Economic Development, and the like. Of that $129 million, 85% of that budget is salaries and benefits, so that's where our dollars are. It's not in ordinary maintenance, which is paper clips, and staples. It is in the dedicated employees' work and the results of which you see throughout our community. 70% of our total operational budget is police, fire, and Department of Public Works. So the community set the priorities on the city side clearly through time. It's reflected in the council's discussion of whether it be budget or during the course of the year, and our dollars are put to where the community wants to see those dollars spent. So where do we go from here? We had to start with reforms. Going back 5 years when I first took the job and my analysis of the budget and the things we had to take on, we looked at the budget busters, and we talked about them earlier. It's healthcare, the pension retirement system, and debt service. Our 5-year plan has worked on all 3 of those categories. When I came on as city manager, employees were paying 10% of their healthcare costs. We have, through negotiations and other work, have our employees now at 80-20, taking on 20% of their healthcare costs. New hires are taking on 25% of their healthcare costs, and we've had transitioned about half of our employees to reasonable copays, which align with private sector and also continue to result in saving dollars. But I started off with the goal of 75-25 for all employees. That was 5 years ago, so if people say I'm persistent, I accept that as a badge of honor, because we're still working on it and we're still not there. But the reality is, when we talked about just on co-payments and some of the changes that we've done, we cut out the middleman for prescription drugs, and we're now saving some $5 million annually. Retirees, a very difficult issue that was taken up, but when we looked at preserving services against benefits that we can no longer afford, and looking really at what the taxpayer can afford, in a difficult vote that was taken by council, is we switch approximately 400 retirees to Medicare by adoption of Section 18. It saved the city tens and tens of millions of dollars. That's been redirected back to services. But when you put all those together, just on the healthcare changes that we've done so far, you're looking at well over $50 million that's been redirected from an indirect cost, like healthcare, that's been redirected back to services without having to ask the taxpayer to come up with more dollars. So we keep looking at retooling government again, and again. Over the last 5 years, we've reduced our workforce from 2,200 to now 1,800. So we're doing more with less. That mantra that continues to be out there, we've delivered on that, and we continue to deliver on that, and we continue to win awards on the services we provide in spite of all these economic forces. For this year, we've frozen 50 positions to date because we recognized what we're up against. That's affected our ability to provide services, but we continue to deliver those services through attrition. We reorganized divisions of city government. We outsourced when it was appropriate, and we incorporated technology where we could. So we've done the hard work to date, but revenues continue to go down dramatically. Expenditures, again, fixed, continue to go up, and fixed costs, those fixed costs are growing at alarming rates. So we've got a $30 million budget deficit for next year that I identified approximately 8 weeks ago. And the reality of layoffs and cuts in services that our community depends on. And a lot of that is factored on realities that so go the Commonwealth, so goes the city, back to that state aid item I presented. $5 million cut from this current fiscal year from the state due to 9C cuts because of the budget strife at the Beacon Hill level. And then approximately $18 million of my total $30 million problem, a result of the Commonwealth's reductions in state aid for next year. And when you look at that, and as I stated earlier, there's no white knights and there's no silver bullets here. We have to take action. So we've done the work so far to reduce that $30 million down to some $17 million, and it wasn't easy work. I went to my non-union, non-represented employees, and asked for their support to transition them to 75-25, as well as take a 0% increase for next year. And I'm asking our collective bargaining units to do the same, although there is resistance. But the savings alone on our non-represented for them taking this issue on is $850,000 that'll go toward saving non-represented jobs. Again, an unprecedented move by a city manager to say, if you're willing to step up, if you're willing to participate, if you're willing to work with us to save jobs and preserve services, I will take each dollar, each and every dollar saved from that unit, in this case on non-represented, and save non-represented jobs. And I think that's what it's all about right now. It's that the fact is that we're all in this together, and together we can work our way through this. As I said earlier, I've frozen 50 positions to date. I expect to freeze another 20 next year as they become open. Again, each and every one of these issues will result in the fact that we will reduce our ability to provide services to the community, but minimize layoffs. That'll save about $2.5 million once all the benefits for those open positions, healthcare and otherwise, are factored. We went forward and filed special legislation to deal with a great decrease in our pension earnings, to extend that pension schedule with the blessing of that Rock of Gibraltar City Auditor Jim Del Signori. And we also proposed to the legislature an early retirement incentive. Now here's where that has to stay firm. We're going to early retire approximately 100 employees, but the pressure will always be to fill those positions. This will result in a decline in our ability to provide services to this community. It'll mitigate layoffs, but we cannot be in a position to refill those positions, otherwise we're lying to ourselves, we're lying to the taxpayers and future generations for the liability that will create. We factored a $2 million savings from that, but it means we can only refill no more than 15 to 20% of those positions over the long term, so we can actually take those savings and stabilize our budget. We didn't play the game of using one-time money for recurring costs, but we did use one-time monies for one-time costs to address the majority of what we have for a snow deficit for this year. And we're using dollars from healthcare reform. Our healthcare trust has a surplus as a result of difficult work of the council and the administration, as well as our employees being willing to take on additional costs. And we'll use some $1.5 million as a stabilization for 1 year to continue to make sure that we can get through at least fiscal year 2010 at this point. But the key to one-time monies is that they're not going to be here the year after. And that sometimes is easy to lure into a false sense of security that that money will be again available in 2011. It won't be. So we're going to have, anytime I use one-time monies, that gap will exist next year or the following fiscal year, and it may mean additional cuts if revenues in the economy don't turn. There's no rabbits out of the hat, and there's no buried treasure. I live with the mists of Franny McGraw, the ghost of Franny McGraw, on my Sundays in here, as I hear almost like Jacob Marley, the chains and the treasure chest being dragged throughout City Hall. But the only way it happens is the way I described, is difficult work and day in and day out. There's more actions ahead and absolutely critical in order for us to stabilize this. And it's going to involve my administration, the City Council, our state legislature, and our employees all at the table. Collective bargaining units, employee health care reforms. As I said, there's more than resistance to this. The reality is if our collective bargaining units take on 25% of their health care and just take a zero for next year, a signed zero, not the lie of we're not going to include it in our budget, we won't recognize the liability, and then we'll see what happens 2 years out. Unfortunately, our revenues aren't going to turn. That liability will exist, and if we don't recognize it by carrying the dollar amount, some $2 million for what I'm factoring as a mid-year 2%, and if they don't agree, I own that liability. If they'll agree to a zero, I can eliminate the reality of carrying that $2 million in the budget and put that back to preserving services, which is critical. But there's a lot of communities out there talking about a freeze in wages and that we'll pay you in 2011. We're not going to have that ability, so I'm not going to lie to this community or this council. So we're going to stick to asking for a signed zero on the bottom line. So if you take those two issues, a zero and the rest of our employees be willing to go to a 25% contribution rate, as well as copay changes, you're looking at the better part of $4.3 million that can be put back to work for our taxpayers, preserving services and jobs if our unions are willing to come to the table. Again, my commitment is every union that agrees to these changes, I'll put those dollars to work stabilizing that membership's jobs and the services they provide. We've talked about departmental fee increases, reasonable for the services provided, approximately another $500,000. looking at issues like the pay-as-you-throw program for our sanitation or trash bag process. And if we increase that by 50 cents, which I projected 2 years ago would be necessary, we're looking at another $1 million. Program reductions, elimination of divisions and services in their entirety, further departmental divisional reorganizations, all that's part of it. Public-private partnerships continue and looking toward that as some solution toward pilot. But reforms will be the heartbeat of keeping our community and organization moving forward. Additional actions outside my purview would be the state's emergency recovery bill the governor's brought forward between hotel motel taxes, the telecom loophole, and others that have been presented. They projected an $11 million for the city if that were to be passed by the legislature. Federal stimulus dollars, we just got notice that there's some $800,000 for law enforcement. We continue to work with our delegation at the federal level to see what the federal stimulus actually says. I'm not quite sure anybody knows, but it's, I think, worth a few $100 billion. And then one important notice to make is that Mass College of Pharmacy came forward and began the process of working with us as a not-for-profit and tax-exempt organization. And though it's small in stature, it is larger than life as a recognition that we're all in this together and that our not-for-profits do have a stake in the long-term success of our community, and stepping forward in that fashion is going to make a great difference going forward. But what's in jeopardy if we don't take action? Right now I've got some 400 jobs that are slated for layoffs. We're impact bargaining as we speak. And what I can tell you is it will be a law of diminishing returns, and I don't say that to be inflammatory or to bring hype, but we just walked through a process of attrition, reduction, and positions being lost. And as efficient as we are in the technology and all the things that we're doing, it is a law of diminishing returns, and it will be less with less if we can't have some of these solutions I brought forward. But stability over the next 18 months can make a great difference. We continue to push economic development, and that includes City Square, which I will tell you that will begin this year, which is going to equate to jobs and more jobs. We've got other firms from well outside of Worcester looking at Worcester because of its unique position to bring jobs here and create vitality. And I think there will be one of the few communities in the Commonwealth, if not the region, that actually continues to see growth in spite of the economy. We'll look at the thoughtful transfer of the airport. We'll continue to reinvest in infrastructure with some creativity, long-term leases of public assets, drawing out one-time monies to reinvest in one of the most critical aspects of our community, which is our infrastructure in streets and sidewalks, staying away from the desire because of the lure of a false sense of security is to take those one-time monies and plug them into the budget to pay salaries. That's a recipe for disaster. And a continued focus on public education and reforms in those public-private partnerships I've talked about. I don't think any of us can predict the future. I'll stand here and tell you I can't, but I'll commit to you in my role as city manager working with the city council is to continue to propose new reforms, new thoughtful ways of doing business, and continue to rein in our costs where we can, and to competitively position us in the future in spite of all these negative economic forces. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to again thank the mayor and the city councils that are here for inviting me to speak, along with the Research Bureau. It's a beautiful room. You should be very, very proud. I should also like to acknowledge two of my selectmen are here, Maura Miller and John Limbo, to make sure that I don't stray off the farm too badly, I guess. I'm going to take a little different approach than the city manager, and I'm going to do a little bit about what's happening in Shrewsbury, but I'd also like to take a macro approach, if I could, so that I can maybe create some discussion points and also give you all a takeaway that you may want to go back and talk to your respective constituencies. I'm not going to get into the micro aspect of it because city managers are a lot like people that have had operations where they try to compare surgical scars. You know, they say, you ought to see mine. If yours is bad, you ought to see mine. And I'm not going to do that because we all have these very, very bad. That joke didn't go very well, did it? We all have very difficult budget situations, which are very much predicated upon our own local conditions. But let me talk a little bit about what's happening in Shrewsbury. You know, the title of this discussion is Municipal Budgets in Limbo, How Low Can They Go? Well, they'll go as low as necessary because we all have to file a balanced budget. We don't have the ability to have any amount of deficit spending. We also have to be thinking not only about 2010 currently, but we're going to be thinking about 2011 and 2012. So the city manager is correct in a very careful use of one-time revenue to make sure that you don't take a short-term gain and really hurt yourself very much in the long term. We actually began preparing our fiscal 2010 budget in July. The Board of Selectmen was very concerned about what they saw in 2010. They had a series of meetings and workshops and very clearly stated the community's goals for fiscal 2010, which would mean that we were going to have to operate within our existing revenue stream. So the budget that I filed in January is imbalanced. It is obviously considerably off where we were from a year ago, some $2 million. Local aid in Shrewsbury makes up 22% of our total revenue stream. We handle local aid in Shrewsbury as a general receipt. We don't consider it state school aid, and we don't consider it general government aid. We consider it as a general receipt. Along that line, I filed my budget with a 10% reduction in state aid. The governor's number is considerably higher. When you look at the governor's House 1 filing, both on the revenue and charge side, is actually a $2 million variance between where I am and where the governor is. I'm hoping that the actual number that will ultimately be issued by the state legislature will be somewhere between those two numbers. You know, the governor and A&F had to make projections very, very early in the budget cycle, and conditions have changed considerably. In our own case, for instance, we're looking at local receipts being some $2 million in fiscal year fiscal year 9. We're going to collect approximately $2 million less in local revenue than in fiscal year 2008. And comparatively speaking, we're a small operation, so I can only imagine what that number must be for the entire Commonwealth. We did have a 9C reduction of $337,000. So we're dealing, like all communities, we're dealing with local receipt collections being down, a 9C reduction of a proportion dependent upon the size of your local aid pie, and all these other costs that seem to be piling up. Currently, we're in limbo to the extent being that we have a balanced budget. If we went to town meeting tomorrow morning, we'd be able to enact a budget, set a tax rate, comply with the provisions of Proposition 2.5. It would be horrendous, but we would be in balance. So we're waiting for some numbers to mature. We're waiting for that state aid number, which is going to be very critical for us. We're looking at our local receipts, trying to project things like motor vehicle excise tax, which is a substantial portion of our local aid, of our local revenue. We're also dealing with the snow and ice deficit and the storm damage. For those communities which were affected by the storm damage, we sort of have a double whammy here. And normally you can pretty much deal with a snow and ice deficit, but in effect, our deficit for cleaning up the debris as a result of the ice storm, even with the reimbursement we'll be getting from the federal government, will be substantial. Again, another drain that we're having in a very difficult year. We're also obviously waiting for the state legislature and to see what will happen. I'm really counting very much on an early local aid resolution to give us some idea. The towns run on the town meeting form of government. Selectmen are coming up on periods when they have to sign warrants and begin to put into place actions necessary to get their budgets enacted. The city has a little more flexibility to the extent that the council sits at the legislature and they have the ability of time to wait a bit longer. But for many of the towns in central Massachusetts, the next 2 to 4 weeks are going to be very, very critical as they make these final spending recommendations. Our budget proposal makes substantial reductions in personnel among the various municipal and school departments. In municipal departments' case, our staffing levels will fall below where they were in fiscal year 1998. And that's pretty much what we're seeing in community after community. Many of managers in the area have always been very, very conservative about filling vacancies, even during the days when things were better, around prior with the run-up to fiscal 2000, and then 2003, 2004, 2005, because we all know that every time you create a position, there's a potential there. Are you going to be able to sustain that spending for the out years? The Board of Selectmen has asked that we review all of our operations. We're evaluating all our operations because we're starting to determine right now, are there businesses that the town of Shrewsbury, which we're currently in, we will no longer do? Because I think there has to be a complete evaluation, top to bottom, every city in town, to align our service delivery with our revenue stream. And I think every community will be facing this in the months and years ahead. But this is really an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to seek out and enact reforms that will realign the regulatory environment, our citizens' expectations with the revenue stream. And this is the macro piece. I'm going to revert now to my Clark University mode. How many people in this room were involved in government prior to 1978? Not many. But prior to 1978, there was kind of an interesting thing that happened in cities and towns. You had town meetings, or you had city council meetings, where there was this actual connection between the regulatory environment, which is the way we did business, both determined locally or determined at the state and federal level, with our citizens' expectations, with our revenue stream. I attended town meeting with my dad starting about age 12, 13. I was kind of a strange child, as you can imagine. I even remember when the fiscal year changed from calendar to July 1 to June 30th. Who remembers that? But in those days, you had these great debates at town meeting because people knew in that audience that when they made a spending decision or they enacted or accepted some statute that created some benefit, they aligned that with their revenue stream. They were all connected. Well, starting in 1978 and certainly with 1980, I would suggest it decoupled. And we've got a regulatory environment, or the way we're doing business, as promulgated at the local, state, and federal level, that's acting independently of our revenue stream. Our citizens' expectations have been decoupled from our revenue stream, and our revenue stream has been decoupled from either one of them, where our revenue stream basically rises and falls on a business cycle. What I'm suggesting is this is an opportunity to enact reforms, to bring those back together, where we make decisions both at the state, local, state, and federal level with an understanding of where the revenue is going to come from, that our citizens' expectations, or our promises, our citizens' expectations come from the promises we make, that we align that with our revenue stream, and that we return to a pre-1978, pre-1980 approach to local government. And that's the macro piece that I wanted to put out there as a means of stimulating some conversation. Thank you.
Okay, we're at the portion of the program for questions. I think we have a few minutes. I know Leanne and Brian need to leave in a few minutes, but when we start. There's a microphone here if you want to come up and use it to ask your question.
Hi, I'm Paul Clancy, City Councilor for the City of Worcester. The City Manager mentioned 2 home rule petitions which the city has sent off to the state legislature. One is for early retirement for city workers, and the second one is the extension of the pension deferral for another 10 years. Both of those are essential, we feel, to the economic health of our city next year. However, we hear that Secretary Kerwin is emphatically opposed to any local measures for either early retirement and even the extension of the pension deferment. Could you enlighten us as to that position?
I think I can talk a little bit about it,
All right.
but I might have to have her follow up with you personally. But I think in general, when we talk about early retirement, she has generally been opposed to early retirement and has kind of expressed those views for the governor. And I think it's a lot of what you said is that you need to be very careful about how you manage it and what the backfill situation is and what your loss of institutional knowledge becomes. So that's something that she's very worried about. So I know that within our office, David Sullivan, our general counsel, has been working on pension reform items, and also with our director of local services has been working on these items. And I think they're working on a plan that might be more all-inclusive than an individual municipality by municipality plan. I don't have the details of that at this time, but it's something we can certainly follow up on.
Okay, and beyond what the city manager had to say about the early retirement plan, it's very important to note that we understand that we're always a year behind on the economic curveball. Yeah. So 2011 will probably be more bleak for us than next fiscal year, 2010, and probably beyond. So we expect to contract employees in this city for a considerable amount of time. This is not a short-term effort. This is to get those people off the rolls, and we do not intend to replace them in the near future. So if that message could be carried forth, we'd be appreciative of that.
We would definitely take that message back.
Good morning. My name is William Bro, Worcester resident. This will be to the manager and to you if you can answer it. I realize we're going to be getting a lot of money, the state as a whole, $6 billion, $8 billion, whatever that happens to be. Number one, how soon will it come? And number two, the manager, I know you don't want to give up negotiations. I just saw out in the Midwest somewhere that the president went, a class was graduating of 25 to 30, similar to Worcester. That article was in the Globe, and that money did go for that. I know you maybe don't want to give up any dollars, pay me now or pay me later in that context, but we have a class that just graduated from the police department, 32. That impacts everybody in the room. They got three things, a salute, a handshake, and a pink slip. That hurts this whole community. We have a class coming up in April of the fire department, 19 people coming out of there to graduate from the fire department. This community, everybody in this room is going to be impacted by that. 167 Pleasant Street was there last week. It's gone this week. When that happens, how much are you willing? The fire chief a month ago said we can't go under a 406. I believe what he says. This is going to be up to you to balance, not only negotiations with the fire department, because if they don't want to give it up now, if the police department don't want to give up pay raises and stuff like that, how are you going to balance it? Maine South can't wait. The city as a whole can't wait. How are you going to try to balance that to keep people in these public safety positions that everybody in this room needs as a whole?
What I would say, I'll respond before the Commonwealth, is that what I said in my words was priorities and choices. And these aren't going to be easy. You talked about the 406, the complement for the Worcester Fire Department, through the very difficult process of redeployment, which we went through 2 years ago, as well as recent station closings, 2 stations closed. We've done the difficult work of retooling Worcester Fire to meet the needs of the community while recognizing what we can and can't afford. 406 right now is our baseline number for authorized complement that we intended to staff. We put a class on to make sure we maintain 406. It's a balance between staff and overtime in order to provide those services, trying to maintain that 5-minute response time, National Fire Protection Standards. And the reality right now is we're talking about a number that would go down to, I believe it's 333 as a result of the cuts. So well below that standard that we had set through the difficult work of redeployment with this community. But again, priorities and choices. Dan mentioned it. Dan mentioned it. The reality that statutorily I'm required to balance the budget. We'll bring forward a balanced budget proposal to the City Council. I would like nothing more than to pretend that this problem doesn't exist and bring back a proposal to Council that was full of one-time monies and false solutions just to buy time. But I'm not going to lie to this community or present that false sense of security. We've got priorities to establish and choices to make, and the results of which are going to be that we're going to be understaffed in various areas, or we're going to have to make decisions to eliminate services altogether. Certain scopes that our community expects that we'll no longer do, and then redirect those dollars to what the community decides are the priorities. And that's what we'll continue to bring forward We'll bring forward creative solutions. I'd like nothing better than to put that police class on. When you talk about the safest city in New England, it's a result of having officers on the street, programmed efficiently, and going and targeting where the crime is. And we know that that complement is necessary to maintain those staff levels for the safety of the community and the officers that are serving us. But bottom line is we got to be able to pay those salaries, and that dollar's got to come from somewhere. Now, I can tell you that the federal stimulus money that you referenced in Ohio, we're shaking our head. We're not quite sure how that transpired, and not sure if it had more to do with politics and substance. But when you're talking about trying to achieve $17 million worth of reductions, you're looking at the Worcester Police Department, and you're talking about the potential of up to 80 officers. That class is 32, which is part of that 80. And the dollars and cents point to the fact that every department has to be able to take on some of that, short of wiping out entire departments or entire services and leveling expectations that Dan touched on again. All that's going to be part of this upcoming process. The reality is it comes down to priorities and choices.
Can I respond as well to that? We've been working at A&F with all of our agencies. It's actually been a #1 priority of ours over the last few weeks in analyzing the federal stimulus bill. And what you said, was very typical of what I've heard from many people, including people within my office. The 6 or 8 or 10 billion, what are the dollars that we're getting? Because we really need to try to figure that out, and we're still working through that. Also, in line with that, what strings are attached to those dollars? What are the matching requirements? When does it go away? So I think it's, those are things that we've been very concerned with, and I think we're still working through the details of it. And some states, I think I'll use Vermont as an example, they've already started to draw some federal funds and had to immediately turn around and pay it back because they didn't know all the rules that applied. So we're kind of navigating through this process very slowly, and it's, trust me, for us, it's a very new process that we've been dealing with within our office. It's kind of outside of our box, and I think all of us, the team within my office is really struggling with analyzing this, along with all of our agencies. But I will assure you that all hands are on deck on this, and people are really, looking into figure out what Massachusetts can draw down from this and how this will impact our budget. But we want to make sure that we're spending the dollars responsibly and looking at some of the one-time items so that we don't just delay the inevitable and have, further reductions and cuts and layoffs in the out years versus right now.
John Carnegie, I'm a Worcester resident, and I have a business in Shrewsbury. I think that the challenge that the Commonwealth is facing is obviously quite substantial, but we do have some advantages that are available that I think, as the opportunity that Town Manager Morgado mentioned, to revisit the macro perspective, you may want to entertain. Number one, I have a bill that's presently sponsored by State Representative John Benenda, which is an economic development incentive program which enables people to financially benefit from helping to attract businesses to the Commonwealth. Secondly, we have over 250,000 students that come to our colleges and universities and are refined as intellectual capital that, quite frankly, when they look at the analysis, are looking forward to grabbing their diplomas and leaving the Commonwealth. I think an opportunity exists to create incentives to retain them in a 3, 5, or 7-year period of time. It might be land trusts for affordable housing. It could be other incentives pertaining to the kind of income that they generate, and ultimately, again, the more that they spend locally, it has the cascading effects. And finally, again, within the green jobs, we have a Worcester resident who has just been assigned to take over the responsibilities for that. I have a company that's growing green jobs, and I think that the opportunity to really top line the technologies for energy efficiencies are the kinds of things that can be providing more jobs, not only within the Commonwealth, but enabling the rest of the country to benefit, so we can help to attract some of those dollars in hand as well. So the challenges are there and they're real, but we have some assets, and if we can, at the top line level, really work aggressively to that. I know that with the facilitator for the retreat this past weekend, who is the head of the Mass Municipal Association, that there can be some tie-ins to accelerate that legislation, put it in place, and engage the 4.6 million of us that are over the age of 18 to look at our Rolodexes and help to attract more businesses to Massachusetts and grow our jobs there, because that's the variable that ultimately I think is the one that we do have an opportunity to impact, and that should be something aggressively pursued.
If I could comment on what John had mentioned, I said in my earlier presentation, I believe the city in this region is uniquely positioned in these difficult economic times because of prudent practice, investments in infrastructure, and available workforce, and other factors. but it is a competitive global marketplace right now. And I can talk to you, and I won't give you specifics, of Worcester-based companies with deep roots that are now looking at the realities of that competitive marketplace, what they have to do to be able to compete in that marketplace. And when it comes to pennies on a transaction, in order to stabilize that firm, there are other states offering free land. They're going to build the buildings for them. They're not going to charge them any taxes. They're going to give them their workforce trained and available, no utilities, and free water. And you're talking about thousands of jobs. And so that's a competitive environment that we're faced with. We're approached often with our partners at Choose Worcester, WBDC, and others to be able to put these business proposals together, bring activity here, help those expand here. And when you look at what other states are doing, Michigan, Maryland, New York, and others, and you see what they're able to put on the proposal, which is cash on a barrel, no strings attached, just bring your jobs. And you see how we're uniquely positioned, yet the only piece that we have to be able to offer locally is the TIF. Anything else that we do, tax increment financing, anything else that we do requires legislative approval because there's no existing funds or actions that we can use. So in that competitive marketplace, when we're uniquely positioned, when we can create jobs, which ultimately will be the driver of our local economy. Again, self-determination, rugged individualism, let's make it happen here, and then hope for the white knights and the troops to arrive. The bottom line is we got one hand tied behind our back because in that global marketplace, that's what's driving right now the bottom line. And these companies are right to be able to seek out the very best deals for themselves in that competitive marketplace to be able to drive their costs down to compete with India, China, Pakistan, and others. So that's what we're faced with. And that it goes to John's point, we've got to retool how the Commonwealth looks at economic development, working in partnership with the hubs, Worcester, Springfield, Boston, Lowell, Lawrence, and others, as well as our partners in town government, to create that environment, to create jobs, to make jobs that are here stay, and to have companies that are here expand. So it takes economic policy at all levels to pull that off.
Amen. Eric Schultz with Fallon Community Health Plan. First of all, I want to say to each of you up here, thank you, not just for being here today, but for the leadership and brain power you're bringing to some really tough issues, and it's a thankless job many days, so thank you. I have a question with regard to, no surprise, health insurance and healthcare costs, and try to put it in the context of Manager Morgado's question at the end. How can we bring those bubbles together and create an alignment of kind of expectations and choices, which is so important these days. Health insurance, 90% of health insurance premium is driven by underlying medical costs. That's the real tiger that we've got to get our arms around. For the last several weeks, health insurance and hospital CEOs have been meeting with the governor, with Secretary Bigby, with Secretary Kerwin. And the challenge that the leadership has given to us is, what can you do creatively to slow down the cost of health insurance? And one of the ideas that certainly is emerging is to come up with creative health insurance designs that connect the buyer, the individual person covered by the insurance, with the choices that they're making. In the past, we have an ID card and we can go anywhere for the same price, and we've been benefited by being really separated from the cost of our choices. The challenge we face is, as we come up with these innovative designs, the premiums do come down, but the contribution, we talked a lot about 20% and 25%, and that's great progress. But at the end of the day, if we bring down health insurance premiums by $5 or $10, which is big, contributions set based on a percentage of the cost waters down any of that impact. And most of us believe that if it costs more for health care, it's better. And until we connect the decision with the cost of that choice, we're not going to be able to make the headway. So my question to you, Leanne, if I may, is where is the thinking these days in the administration of moving away from a contribution based on percentage to one which is based on a fixed dollar contribution. And this is a strategy that's been used quite a bit in the private sector. And it's making a big headway. It creates an opportunity for kind of budget savings down the road as well. Thank you.
I'd love to learn more about it. I think it sounds like there's been some meetings and folks have been challenged. I haven't met with anyone to date and had that discussion. When we talk about contribution ratios, we're always talking about percentages, so I'd love to learn more, and I'm sure the Secretary would, especially in her role as chair of the Commonwealth Connector.
I think that's the point I was trying to make, because in every aspect of how we do business, government, the cost of doing business, we need to reconnect those expectations, the regulatory environment, and the revenue stream. And we should leave this room committed that henceforth and evermore, we're never going to make another decision separating those. That every decision has to be connected with the rest of what it takes to provide a level of service. And I think thank you very much. That's the point I was trying to make, and I appreciate that comment.
I was just going to try to follow up on that. Is there another area that you can talk about where that connection can be made? I know that in Shrewsbury you've talked about the regulatory environment for DEP and EPA. Maybe you can further illustrate what you're saying with another example.
It's everything. It's everything that we do. Most recently it was trench regulations. Now in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to dig a hole, you need to come down to Town Hall and get a trench permit. It's something as simple as that. It's something to like what we're facing, when I say we, the city manager and I, relative to what's happening on the wastewater front. Look, no one wants dirty water, no one wants dirty air. But again, we have an expectation for clean water. We have a regulatory environment that says clean water. Guess what? We better come up with a revenue stream that says clean water. And we can no longer act independently. So every aspect of what we do, from a new well-intentioned, everyone should have a permit before they dig a trench. All great ideas. Connect it. That's all I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that this is the perfect opportunity to start having those kinds of conversations, not only about what might be on the drawing board in the way of new costs for doing business, but also reevaluating everything that we've done in the last 10, 15, and 20 years and saying, look, is this the best use of our resources? Because resources are finite, and we need to start making a better ordering of what our priorities are. So if our priorities are going to be healthcare, then they have to be healthcare. If it's clean water, clean water. We can no longer do it all and anticipate or assume that somehow the business cycle will catch up to us and provide the revenue necessary to cover those decisions that we've made previously that we didn't really take into consideration. Hey, what's this actually going to cost?
Getting back to Connie Luke's mayor, getting back to the health insurance issue. In Worcester, we pay $80 million for our health insurance costs, about 16% of the budget, and it is the budget buster that you're going to hear from any community. There are currently proposals to suspend collective bargaining when it deals with the issues of co-pays, et cetera. And that's very radical here in Massachusetts. However, that's what stops us from initiating any reforms and controlling the cost of health insurance. It's subject to collective bargaining, and as a result, we're going no place. To imagine that going from 20 to 25% is a radical concept is absurd in the private market. There have to be limits to our generosity, as Dan Morgado said. We have to have realistic expectations. Is it realistic to assume we can do anything in this state dealing with suspension of collective bargaining when it deals with this kind of issue?
My gut reaction is no. but I don't want that to be the official answer. I think that that's something that it's something that we struggle with, not only on the health insurance side, but it's just on the contract negotiation side. And we're looking at state layoffs as you're looking at city layoffs, and trying to help people understand that when we set these parameters and we set these dollars out there that we're going to have to spend, that means jobs for other people is very difficult. So I don't have a good answer for you for that. And I think we're in the same situation that you are as well.
Good morning. Steve O'Neill, WRTA. I have two of my bosses here, so I thought I'd get up and ask the question. But I think the question, not the question, but the example that Dan Magato was talking about, working at the WRTA is a perfect example of, in pre-1978, making a case for the establishment through state statute for regional transportation authorities. But yet, over time, forgetting to fund those regional transit authorities at the appropriate levels, A, and B, putting a situation in place where the transit authorities are funded in arrears, so that the budgets that you're working on now are our budgets. And it's almost like having a credit card that it maxes out and we can't do anything about it. So having said that, the governor is very fond of making, you present me with a problem, what is your solution? So when he spoke last week here in Worcester, we did come up with a couple of examples that we think, as regional transit authorities, would help us significantly. One is obviously forward funding. The big question is how you get there. One would be to spread the revenue sources for the RTAs over several different, I know we're talking about 19 cents gas hike. Maybe it's something other, looking at other state revenues like the registry of motor vehicles and some other sources. Quite frankly, there's toll credits that are being used extensively throughout the country that Massachusetts, for some odd reason, we're not using those. That could save dollars on the capital side. And believe me, we're all very grateful for the stimulus package that's been put forward. In fact, for the RTAs and the Commonwealth, and for this RTA in particular, it's a substantial number of capital dollars, substantial amount of capital dollars that will be coming to the RTA that will be used prudently. But the fact of the matter is, we need those support dollars to spend those capital dollars. It doesn't make very much sense for us to buy new buses if the operating dollars are not going to be there to substantiate that capital investment. And the final solution I would offer is, I said the revenues, I just lost my train of thought there for 1 second, I'll come back to it, but to come up with a real adequate base of funding that would allow us to provide that service going forward is what we're looking for.
RTAs is one thing that I do deal with. I do
so
oversee the analyst, so I understand the issue, and especially the funding in arrears, which has been such a frustration for all of us. But you're right, it's finding that one lump sum to get us, go into forward funding that I think, unfortunately, we're just in that time where we can't find that. But I do agree that there's some reforms that need to be made there.
I did recall that last one, and that is the Health and Human Service agencies in the Commonwealth have an array of transportation funding mechanisms that they provide themselves, where the RTAs in the Commonwealth have the stock, the infrastructure in place that could be utilized to absorb some of that.
Yeah.
And that's another option.
I'd like to learn more about that too, because I think that, we have been dealing with, I think it was specifically the Department of Disability Services. They had been utilizing some RTA services, but I know that others aren't, and there's been some agreements between the RTAs. So I think that's a good suggestion and something that we should look into.
Okay, we are running up on our time commitment with Brian and Leanne. It's 9:30. We need to let them go. I would like to thank our panel for a great discussion this morning, candid, honest, and tough messages. We appreciate this forum. Thank you, Roberta. And it was a pleasure for us to be involved. So thank you.